Hello, I'm Dick Fleming, a retired European Union staff interpreter. I've been asked to talk a bit today about high-level interpretation. So, what is it? Well, I imagine you've all seen TV footage of two world leaders exchanging pleasantries in front of the cameras, with the help of a usually well-groomed and often much younger person who's acting as interpreter. I'm sure that would qualify as high-level interpretation, as would, for example, simultaneous interpretation at the UN General Assembly. What these meetings have in common is the political importance of the participants, rather than the inherent difficulty of the meetings. In fact, sometimes the higher up you go, the easier the job becomes for the professional interpreter, since meetings at lower level are often highly technical, whereas when the politicians get hold of these issues, they become far less technical and more political. However, political doesn't always mean easier, since it implies persuasion, rhetoric, subtlety, even irony, and often passion. But it's a different sort of challenge to those we face at technical level. Turning now to the European Union, where I worked for 35 years as a staff interpreter, I would say that one of the current difficulties of high-level meetings for interpreters, and this is a phenomenon that has arisen only over the last decade, as the number of member states has doubled, is the fact that very often ministers and prime ministers are now allotted a set number of minutes, sometimes only 2 or 3 minutes, in which to present the position of their country. Now, I suppose this is inevitable given the fact that every country wants to make its position known, the fact that there are twice as many countries as there were at the beginning of the century, and the fact that meetings are no longer than they used to be. Unfortunately, it tends to mean that each country's position is finely crafted into a densely argued written statement, which is then read out by the representative of that country. This is often much less interesting than a genuine discussion, and much more difficult for the interpreter. But I should add that there are still plenty of wonderful moments of genuine discussion at ministerial and prime ministerial level here in the European Union. Not, however, as much as there was when I had the privilege of working at a number of high-level European Union meetings for about 10 years during the 1980s and the early 1990s. Back then, the European Council met about 4 times a year, twice in Brussels and twice in the countries which had the Council presidency that year. And with only 10 and later 12 members of the Council, nobody was going to limit the amount of time that the likes of François Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl or Margaret Thatcher were allowed to have in order to make their views known. So the plenary sessions of those meetings were fascinating. Nobody read out any prepared statements, and there were genuine discussions which were a pleasure to interpret, albeit fairly nerve-wracking at times because you were trying to do justice to what were often very good speakers. Now, while these plenary sessions were fascinating enough, as I said, there was even more excitement to come when the meetings broke up at critical moments, usually when they were finding it difficult to reconcile opposing views on a subject. You'd then have officials frantically running around trying to draft a new version of whatever they were discussing. And while this was happening, in the meantime, the delegates, the prime ministers in the room, would get together in little huddles and try and discuss how to take things further. For example, you might have François getting together with Helmut saying, well, what shall we do now? Or you might have Helmut sidling up to Margaret Thatcher saying, would you be prepared to accept this or that? Whenever that happened, personal interpreters would sweep down upon these huddles and try to help out. Try to help their masters communicate with their peers. And that's where I was lucky, because President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl brought their own personal interpreters, who were always there in the middle of the fray whenever there were these huddles. But Margaret Thatcher never brought her own personal interpreter for one reason or another, and luckily I was the interpreter who was asked to be her temporary personal interpreter whenever there were these European Council meetings. So I was the one who had to move in quickly whenever a scrum was formed in which my Prime Minister was present. And the actual work in these huddles was usually not terribly difficult, provided you were well placed to hear what was said, and you made damn well sure you were well placed. Usually it was just a sentence or two which you would do without taking notes and in consecutive. And sometimes it was as simple as, would you accept a 50% budget rebate, Margaret? From Helmut Kohl, for example, with the answer being even shorter, no, requiring no interpretation. And quite often you had to improvise a reply in French or German because the French or German interpreter was badly placed, hadn't heard something, and so everyone had to help everyone out to make sure that people could understand one another in what were rather difficult conditions with everyone huddling around. We also accompanied our masters to their lunches and dinners, since back then there were no simultaneous facilities like very often we have now. At ministers' meetings we ate with them, sitting alongside them, and whispered to our customers, trying not to talk with our mouths full. But at Prime Ministers' meetings we always ate quickly in advance, rather like waiters in restaurants who eat before they serve meals. And then we sat behind our customers, whispering our interpretation into their ears. So I whispered into English, into Margaret Thatcher's ear. And we did this while they talked and ate. I must say I have some fond memories of these meetings. For example, interpreting President Mitterrand, talking at length after dinner about the Russian Empire, when everyone else was still talking about the Soviet Union, during the time when there were nuclear missiles being deployed in Europe and in Russia. Another tense moment was a one-to-one meeting between Mrs. Thatcher and the Belgian Prime Minister, Wilfried Martens, where Mrs. Thatcher was insisting on the extradition from Belgium of an IRA suspect who was wanted for murder in Britain and had been arrested in Belgium. And with the poor Belgian Prime Minister bravely spelling out all the details of the legal processes in Belgium which had to be gone through before they could think of extraditing this suspect to Britain. All of this was in Dutch, at least what Prime Minister Martens was saying was all in Dutch, which I had to interpret into English in full consecutive. So pretty hairy stuff. But no interpretation was required back into Dutch, fortunately for Mr. Martens and fortunately for me, since I couldn't have done it. In fact, I managed to be privy to a lot of interesting high-level meetings and conversations without actually having a second active language, which is rather unusual, I think. Most of the interpreters who regularly accompany high-level world leaders nowadays will normally be able to work into more than one language, which makes them much more versatile on foreign trips. But even without that asset then, I was able to reap the benefits of working regularly for the same person at high level. So what were those benefits and what are they? Well, first, it's being the proverbial fly on the wall, privy to discussions that journalists would give their eye teeth to observe. Secondly, establishing a close working relationship with a customer. You get to know your customer well, there's usually a certain amount of small talk before or after the meeting. In the case of Mrs. Thatcher, it was usually talk about the weather or gardening, which she was very keen on. And I must say she was always extremely charming to me, to other interpreters, and to other backup staff, for example, the waiters or the tea ladies, much more so than with her peers, the prime ministers, who she tended to bully terribly. Working regularly for the same person, usually with a familiar cast of other participants, also made things much easier for me, because it enabled me to get used to the subjects. And that is something that doesn't often happen when you're interpreting. You don't usually get to know the issues in depth, nor to get to know individual speakers in depth. So all in all, a wonderfully rewarding experience, with incidentally a treasure of anecdotes. But I have to keep them to myself. Unfortunately, I can't share them on a public forum like this for obvious reasons, for reasons of confidentiality. But nevertheless, I hope that I've been able to make high-level interpretation sound sufficiently interesting for those of you starting out in the profession, particularly those of you with more than one active language, for you to think that if one day you were to be given the possibility of doing this sort of high-level interpretation, you would jump at the opportunity. Thank you.